I learned the difference between growth hacking and traditional marketing. The most expensive way possible, not from books or blogs, but from watching my first startup slowly bleed cash while everyone kept telling me we were building brand awareness. Back then, I did what every first-time founder, with a little funding and a lot of fear, does. I hired an agency, approved glossy visuals, nodded along to words like impressions, reach, and CPM, and pretended I understood how any of it would translate into survival. Every month, the reports looked beautiful, charts going up and to the right, and every month my bank balance went down, while user growth stayed flat, and no one could explain to me in plain language why this was acceptable. Other than marketing takes time, which is a comforting sentence, unless you are a startup with 6 months of runway and payroll breathing down your neck. Traditional marketing is built for companies that can afford patience. Big brands buy certainty by buying time. They can spend millions to shape perception because they already have distribution trust and staying power. Startups don't. Startups are fragile organisms pretending to be companies, and fragility changes the rules. When you're fragile, every dollar must either buy learning or buy growth, preferably both at the same time. Anything else is a luxury you cannot afford. I didn't understand that yet. I thought credibility came from looking big. In reality, credibility comes from solving a painful problem so well that users do the marketing for you without being asked. The first time I heard the term growth hacking, I almost dismissed it as Silicon Valley nonsense, another shiny concept designed to sell courses. But desperation has a way of opening your ears. Growth hacking at its core isn't about tricks or virality. It's about alignment. It forces you to tie product distribution and user behavior into a single system. Instead of asking, how do we get attention, it asks, what action, if repeated by users, naturally creates more users? That shift in thinking is brutal because it exposes weak products instantly. You can't growth hack something people don't actually want. No funnel, no copy, no referral program can save you if the value isn't real. Our first real growth experiment wasn't clever. It was almost embarrassing in its simplicity. We stopped spending on ads entirely and spent 2 weeks interviewing users who churned after 7 days. Not surveys, not forms, real conversations. What we learned hurt. The product worked, but onboarding was confusing, and the aha moment came too late. We weren't losing users because of pricing or competition. We were losing them because they didn't understand us fast enough. No marketing campaign in the world could fix that. So we rebuilt onboarding cut features instead of adding them and instrumented everything. Only then did we add a simple referral loop that triggered right after users experienced value. Growth didn't explode, but it became predictable, and predictability is oxygen for startups. This is where traditional marketing and growth hacking truly diverge. Traditional marketing optimizes messaging. Growth hacking optimizes behavior. One polishes the story. The other interrogates reality. Traditional marketing asks how to persuade more people to try. Growth hacking asks how to make more people stick, return, and invite others. For large companies, persuasion at scale makes sense. For startups, persuasion without retention is suicide. I've watched founders celebrate spikes in traffic that felt like victory, only to realize weeks later that nothing changed underneath. Vanity metrics are addictive because they feel like progress without demanding accountability. Another uncomfortable truth is that growth hacking demands cross-functional honesty that most teams aren't ready for. Marketers can't hide behind creative. Product teams can't blame messaging. Founders can't outsource responsibility to agencies. Every experiment forces the question, did this fail because users didn't care or because we didn't deliver? That level of clarity is exhausting, but it's also liberating. It strips away ego. It turns growth into a science instead of a performance. And yes, it's messy. Many experiments fail. Most ideas don't work. But each failure teaches you something specific, something you can act on next week, not next quarter. What people rarely tell you is that growth hacking is emotionally harder than traditional marketing. Traditional marketing gives you the comfort of structured timelines and external validation. Growth hacking gives you raw feedback from users who don't care about your vision, your deck, or your effort. They care about whether your product made their life better in the last 5 minutes. Facing that truth every day requires humility. And humility is not something founders are naturally rewarded for. Investors clap for bold claims, not careful experiments. Conferences celebrate scale, not retention curves. It takes discipline to stay focused on fundamentals when the noise around you is telling you to look bigger than you are. Over time, I realized the real question isn't growth hacking versus traditional marketing. It's timing and intent. Traditional marketing amplifies what already works. Growth hacking discovers what works in the first place. Startups that confuse the two burn money trying to amplify noise. Startups that respect the sequence build quiet engines that eventually become impossible to ignore. Once your growth loops are proven, once retention is strong and value is clear, traditional marketing can pour fuel on the fire. Before that, it just creates smoke. The founders who survive long enough to learn this stop asking which channel is hottest and start asking which user action matters most. They stop chasing virality and start engineering habit. They stop measuring success by how many people saw their brand and start measuring how many people would miss the product if it disappeared tomorrow. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because once you understand that growth is a property of the product, not a department, you begin to see marketing not as something you bolt on at the end, but as something that is baked into every decision, every feature, every friction point, and every moment. Where a user decides whether to stay, leave, or tell a friend, and that realization is where the real tension begins, because now you can no longer hide behind spend or slogans, and you are forced to confront whether what you've built is actually worthy of growth. And that is the moment where most startups stall or break, because the answer is often uncomfortable and demands changes that feel risky and slow and unsexy. And that is exactly where the next part of this story continues, as you decide whether to chase the appearance of traction or do the harder work of building systems that grow because users genuinely want them to, and not because you paid to interrupt them at the right time. And that choice leads directly into what happens next, when pressure rises and the temptation to revert to familiar tactics becomes harder to resist. And you find yourself standing once again at a crossroads where the decision you make will determine not just how fast you grow, but what kind of company you are actually becoming as the clock keeps ticking and the runway keeps shrinking, and the sentence does not end here, but carries forward into the next breath, where the consequences finally reveal themselves. And you realize that growth is never neutral, and the way you pursue it shapes everything that follows, including the culture, the product, and the founder you see in the mirror when you finally stop and look and ask yourself whether this path you are on is really moving you forward or just making it harder to turn back once you cross the line and keep going, even though a part of you knows that the next decision will lock in habits that are much harder to undo later, and that awareness is where the real conflict sharpens and demands an answer without waiting for permission, because time is the only thing startups never have enough of. And this unfinished thought carries straight into the next part, where the pressure peaks and the truth becomes impossible to ignore. and the story moves forward without pause into the consequences of choosing growth at any cost, or choosing growth that actually deserves to last, and the words continue because the sentence itself is not finished, and neither is the lesson that comes with it. As you take one more step forward into the uncertainty that defines every real startup journey, and discover that the hardest part is not learning new tactics, but unlearning the ones that make you feel busy while quietly pulling you away from what actually works. And the sentence keeps moving, because stopping here would suggest closure, and there is none. Yet only momentum and the next choice waiting to be made when you decide how to grow and why, and whether you are strong enough to live with the outcome of that decision when it finally shows up and forces you to confront the truth that growth is a mirror, and what it reflects back at you is determined by how you chose to pursue it when no one was watching. And the story flows onward from here into what comes next, when that realization finally lands and refuses to let go. And it refuses to let go, because once you see how growth really works, you can no longer unsee the damage caused by chasing the wrong kind of traction. And this is where the pressure intensifies, because investors still want charts, teams still want direction, and the market does not pause while you rethink fundamentals. So the temptation to fall back on traditional marketing muscle memory becomes almost irresistible, especially when growth hacking feels slow, uncertain, and brutally honest. And I've watched founders at this stage panic and open the ad spend faucet again, just to feel movement, any movement, even if it's artificial, because silence is terrifying when you're responsible for salaries and expectations. The problem is that once you rely on paid attention too early, it rewires your company in subtle ways. Product decisions start catering to acquisition instead of retention. Roadmaps bend toward features that demo well instead of those that deepen value. Teams celebrate campaigns instead of cohorts. Over time, you don't just buy users, you train yourself to ignore why users leave. Growth hacking, when done right, does the opposite. It slows you down just enough to force clarity. It asks uncomfortable questions, like why only 20% of users reach the core action, why referrals stall after the first invite, why power users behave completely differently from casual ones. Each answer points back to the product, not the pitch, and that feedback loop is what turns fragile startups into resilient ones. Looking back, the founders I respect most are not the ones who hacked growth the fastest, but the ones who resisted shortcuts the longest. They understood that growth is cumulative and fragile, and once you poison it with bad incentives, it takes years to undo. They treated every channel as a hypothesis, not an entitlement. They were willing to say no to traffic they couldn't convert to users. They couldn't serve well, yet to revenue that came at the cost of trust. That restraint looked like weakness to outsiders and felt like agony on the inside, but it created companies that didn't collapse the moment the market tightened, or ad costs spiked, or algorithms changed, because their growth didn't depend on favors from platforms they didn't control. So what actually works for startups isn't growth hacking versus traditional marketing. What works is sequence honesty and courage. Growth hacking first to discover truth, traditional marketing later to amplify it. Anything else is theater. If you're early, your job is not to look big, it's to learn fast. If you're growing, your job is not to grow at any cost. It's to grow without lying to yourself. And if you're tempted to choose tactics that make the numbers look better than the reality underneath, remember that growth always collects its debt eventually with interest. If you've been wrestling with this choice between doing what's loud and doing what works, leave a comment and share where you are right now. Because founders learn faster from each other's scars than from anyone else's success. And if you want more stories like this, told without polish or permission, subscribe to the channel and stay close, because the only real advantage in startups is not knowing the latest tactic, but understanding the consequences of using it before it's too late.